Welcome to Ice Creams, ladies and gentlemen. We have a wonderful guest with us today. So to give a bit of backstory before I introduce our amazing guest, those of you who, like myself, grew up in the 70s and kind of came of age in the 80s, probably very familiar with a movie by the name of The Legend of Boggy Creek. It cannot be, I can't understate what an important film this is because, not only is it a wonderful film in its own right, it basically went on to, it was an inspiration for so many things, including the found footage genre of film. The Blair Witch Project, Daniel Merrick and Edward Sanchez have readily acknowledged that they were inspired by The Legend of Boggy Creek, and why they wouldn't. The director of Boggy Creek was a man by the name of Charles B. Pierce, and today with us I have his daughter. She is the CEO of Pamula Pierce Productions and Boggy Creek LLC. Allow me to introduce Pamula Pierce Barcelou. Pamela, nice to have you on Ice Creams today. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me on your show.
Fantastic, fantastic. Your dad's movie was so important to me, and such a wonderful film, and we'll get to talk about that a little bit. But for right now, I'd like to kick off by asking you, what were your sort of early memories, before the Falk Monster came along, before, The Legend of Boggy Creek, what were your memories of kind of growing up, in the Pierce household there?
So my dad was definitely a character. By the time I was born, he already had his own television show. He was a kind of kiddie show in the afternoon after school. And so he would move around. He worked for here in the States, the NBC affiliate. He started in El Dorado, Monroe, Louisiana, and which is actually the home of the Duck Dynasty guys, if you know the Duck Dynasty guys.
Yep.
That's the area. So he started there, and he had pretty good guests on. He would have like Tiny Tim and the Bonanza guys, Michael Landon, and Dan Blocker was from DeKalb, Texas, not too far from where my dad, ended up. So he ends up in Texarkana, and he's working for KTAL there, Channel 6. He directs the news at night, and then he's got his television show called The Laugh-A-Lot Club, and he was Mayor Chuckles. And at the same time, he opened an advertising agency. Very talented. My dad was a really good artist. He could draw just about anything. He had done the yearbook. He had been voted most likely to succeed and funniest. He had a really good sense of humor. So he has this ad agency, and he starts doing commercials for all of the businesses in Texarkana, Arkansas, and Texas. Texarkana kind of sits on the state line there, and so he starts winning awards, and he's got the bank as one of his customers, and another one of his customers was this man Buddy Ledwell, Mr. L.W. Ledwell, and Mr. Ledwell owned a big trucking company. They custom built all kinds of trucks, trash, just whatever, lots of trucks. Mm. So my dad would make these my dad was very influenced by like Ford, John Ford and stuff. So he would make these kind of, these epic kind of commercials for Mr. Ledwell and others. And so I think he had always wanted to do, probably was just always pulled into the entertainment, working at the stations and going to the movies, sneaking into movies and all that kind of stuff. So he had decided so he meets Earl Smith, who is his writing partner. Mm-hmm. Later on, Earl and my dad wrote the famous line, "Go ahead, make my day."
Right.
Clint Eastwood, sudden impact. But so they meet at a party, at a Christmas party. And Earl had been from that area, El Dorado, and he had gone to Los Angeles, but he was back. And so my father had never seen a script before. And so Earl as a he was screenwriting. I think he had done some films actually for the Navy or something like that. Right. So anyway, they connect together and they decide that they're going to make this movie. And at first it was like a Western. They were going to make like later on my dad kind of did these adventure mountain man. So I think it was something like that at first. Right. Well, at the same time this is happening, the news reports are coming out of Falk, Arkansas, about 15 miles away, that there were these sightings of this Bigfoot kind of creature. We didn't really know about Bigfoot too much, Yeah. This is 1971, and it's making national news. It's bringing, all kinds of journalists in, and then there Bobby Ford is attacked. So that's kind of my first memory of actually, Boggy, where it kind of starts. All the kids were talking about it in elementary school. And then shortly after that, I heard my dad telling my mother that he was going to make a movie about this Bigfoot creature.
Right. Okay.
So, yeah. So anyway, there was he and Earl had gone to Los Angeles, and they were driving down Sunset Boulevard when they saw these teenagers wearing Falk Monster t-shirts.
Okay.
So my dad said, "Oh, pull over." Yeah, pull over. So they pull over and he starts talking to him. And as he's getting back in the car, he says to Earl, we're making the wrong movie. We're going home. And so and they called it Tracking the Falk Monster. And then
wow,
it's working.
That's incredible.
So he convinces Mr. Ledwell, L.W. Ledwell, so he went to all the businesses trying to raise money for this movie.
Sure.
And nobody was interested, except he does talk Buddy Ledwell into putting up, I think it was about $30,000, which was kind of a lot of money back in those days,
sure.
And he said that it was going to be for a small regional film, is the way that he sold it. And then he ends up running out of money on the third day of production, and most of the money had been spent. He filmed the movie in Technoscope technology, which is a wide angle format. So when it finally played and it was up on the screen, it made you feel like you were there. So in the restoration we just did with the George Eastman Museum, we restored that wide angle, which everything in the home market, including everything on television, has been a pan and scan print.
So now
where you were
widescreen.
Yep. You were literally only getting like a thumbnail of the screen as the action happened. So now it's back, which it's so uncanny, but Technoscope, that format, mask 4K.
Gotcha.
So everything. So it's wonderful.
So before we get to the restoration, because I want to go step first, because I know that must have been a heck of a job to get that done. I want to go back first for a second. You were in Boggy Creek. You were in Legend, right? What are your memories of, as a girl? How old were you when you were shooting, Pamela?
So I was in the third grade when we shot that. It was I was at school, and they came down, or they said over the intercom, whatever, to get my things together. I was leaving early, and so my uncle, which was my mother's brother, actually had come to pick me up. And he said, your dad wants you out. They're shooting. We were actually shooting at the Ledwells. In Steve Ledwell, the son, in his, there was a little, cottage there on the property. And he was married to, this is a little trivia here. He was married to one of the girls in the trailer that says, "Do y'all want a Coke?" And then Steve, yes, and Steve's the one that assigned me the film. And Steve also plays, he's one of 3 people that played the monster. So
Wow.
that's a little trivia there for you. So yes, so I run in and I say, Grandpa, Grandpa, we saw him, we saw the fat monster. And that's my real mom in the scene, Bessie. She's playing Bessie Smith, and she says, shh, you're gonna wake your grandfather. And then she says she's gonna get a switch if we don't be quiet.
Being a girl at the time, being a young girl at the time, because I mean, I literally, as I said to you, I went back and rewatched the film last week. And boy, like, does it ever hold up? I mean, it's great. It's really eerie. There's some real eeriness in specifically, definitely in specific segments. Was it creepy to you as a girl shooting with this big monster walking around, or was it just fun?
So when the creature steps out in my scene, that's an actual scream, because I didn't know that we were going to see him that day. And when he steps out, I didn't know that that was somebody in a costume, you know. So that's a real scream, and I'm really. But other than that, I wasn't that scared because I was behind the scenes a lot, you know. So I knew what he was doing, and it, you know, so it was like kind of my part of, like, I was behind the scenes. It's like a magician that's, you know, if you're there and you see the inside of the tricks, it's not quite the same.
Gotcha.
Though I will say that I grew up as a child being afraid because my dad liked to scare us. So he would either come up with these stories to scare us, or he would literally physically hide and jump out, or he would drive down a mountain and say, "Oh my God, I've lost the brakes," and you know, that kind of stuff.
Okay, I'm really glad that you're getting into this about your dad's sense of humor, because when I was rewatching it last week, and I'm thinking to myself, man, he had to, like, there's a really, like, it's a great film, it tells a great story, but there's a real macabre sense of humor in some of those scenes. I mean,
Yeah.
the way that it's kind of like, one minute it's like, you know, oh, we're listening to the lovely, wonderful music song of Travis, and there's a monster, you know, and then it goes, oh, and here's some lovely nature scenes, and there's a dead cat, and it, and like, I'm watching it as a 50-year-old man, and I'm thinking, man, this guy had he must have really had a good sense of humor. That's amazing.
Well, so it was kind of meant to be, I think. You know, the way that it all came together, it was just serendipitous. So my dad gets so I told you, so he runs out of money on the 3rd day, and he has to go to Mr. Leadwell, and he has to tell Mr. Leadwell that he doesn't have any more money. So it's like, either you give me another, I think he needed 60,000, he said, or whatever, or you're going to lose your first money. Like, either give me more, or we're gonna lose everything, and it's all done because I can't finish. So Mr. Lidwell gives him enough money to finish. The man who was the CFO for Mr. Lidwell at the time, and his CPA, like an accountant and stuff, he told me that the first time he ever saw my dad, Mr. Lidwell was pointing at him and said, "Follow him. He's costing me way too much money." So anyway, but Tommy ended up going to work for my dad then in that same position later on in 1975 when Mr. Little and my dad broke up. But anyway, so he was he has the film in the can, as they say, and he goes to Los Angeles, where he is connected to Jaime Mendoza Nava, and Jaime is the composer of the film. The Legend of Boggy Creek is the first documentary to have its own musical score, you know, written for it.
Yeah.
And it's the, you know, so anyway, but Jaime connected, so he had a production house there. So they did all the post-production work. And what had happened was all of those guys had worked for Disney, the Tom Boutros, the editor, Jaime, and others. had worked for Disney and they had been laid off. And so they band together and they formed this production company, right? So even though my dad was a first-time filmmaker, by the time he gets that footage to Los Angeles, he's really in the hands of professionals, you know? I mean, those are Disney guys. And that's where those songs come in, you know? That, and later on, I remember my dad said that was, so he wasn't, my dad sings the song,
the Travis Crabtree song?
Not Hey Travis, but the Nobody Sees the Flowers Bloom But Me.
Okay.
You know that. So that's my dad singing. Oh, wow. And he told me that they did that because they needed a transition, is what he said. That they needed a transition because the creature had gone away for like 8 years and nobody saw him. And then he comes back and he's kind of with a vengeance. So they needed a transition in between there. So that was that. But also my father was very influenced by Disney and like Animal Kingdom, you know, the Mutual of Omaha, the it wasn't Animal Kingdom, it was what was the name? Marlon Perkins. And anyway, it was a Disney show on Sunday nights.
Well, there was that show, they used to have The Wonderful World of Disney that used to come on, right? And then there's almost when I'm watching it last week, like The Legend of Boggy Creek again, it almost feels like in segments there, like it feels like it's one of those nature documentary type things, and then it suddenly like it gives it this kinetic energy where it's swinging from no, it's scary, no, it's nice, no, it's scary.
Well, you know, so the other thing is it really is based on a true story. So that dialogue, the dialogue that you hear in the film is the actual things that the people were talking about or whatever when the encounter occurred. And when the movie was released, it was released as a documentary, actually. And it becomes the first docudrama. It kind of pioneers that film format, but it was a documentary. Actually, if you adjust the numbers today for inflation, Filmmaker magazine adjusted it in like 2017 or something to 145 million.
Wow.
So yeah, it was that. If you take those numbers in, it makes The Legend of Boggy Creek the third highest grossing documentary in history.
That's incredible. And let's, for some of our younger viewers that are watching Ice Screams today and don't necessarily have the same context, let's be clear here. The Legend of Boggy Creek was playing up against Deliverance, The Godfather.
Yeah.
These were some real heavy hitter movies.
Yeah, big studio movies. The Poseidon Adventure was that year. Cabaret. Yeah. So kind of, some other classics were born in that year. So, and independent filmmakers really didn't exist too terribly much. So what he was doing was very pioneering. When my dad was still shooting the film, it was he and like 5 high school guys. Okay. They had this unwieldy like camera that they had borrowed, and they're out in the swamps and these like, sloshing through the swamps with a boat, like a flat bottom boat. And so it was very intense, almost like guerrilla, filmmaking today. And then they get to Los Angeles. And as I said, he was in good hands. I mean, Tom Boutros did an excellent job in editing the film. And it's just that the whole thing, even the ending, when you have a true story like that, it's very difficult a lot of times to end the film. If you've ever seen Dreaded Sundown, that was one that it was a brilliant ending, but that was my mother's ending, kind of, by the way, that my mother came up with that ending. But it was so when you've got a true story like that, I mean, how do you end it?
Yeah.
So that is my question that I'm asked. Probably one of the most is, are there still sightings? And there are still sightings
Of the
of the
Falcons.
creature today. Yep.
Wow, that's
So
incredible. So okay, so your dad, goes through these struggles, to put this film together. What was the feeling like within your family when it's a success? It comes out and people are lining up around the block to see it. What's the energy like in your family then?
it was, I mean, that's like winning the lottery or something. So my dad was ecstatic. Almost right away, he bought a Corvette. So that was just exactly who he was, and a gun. Well, he always had guns, but so he didn't have a distributor though.
Okay.
So so like 2 weeks after, so it's a big hit in Texarkana, as you said. The lines are forming around the blocks. People are bringing their lunch with them. They're sleeping, camping out there to make sure and get tickets. And so he would say, my dad would literally, it's so bad, but he would say, come on, hop in the car. Let's go see how rich we're getting. And we would drive in the car and just look at the lines, okay? And he would just say, oh, and he would be just thrilled. It was like a kid in a candy store. It's like, look at that, look at that. Can you believe this? And so then there was a defective print, I believe, still in Los Angeles. So he convinces those guys to give him that print, Jaime and those guys. So so Technoscope was owned by Technicolor. So that he gets a second print of the film, and they send it to Shreveport, which is about 45 minutes away from Texarkana. In fact, Falk is if you drive between Texarkana and Shreveport, you go across Boggy Creek. So he sends the other, and it does the same thing at the Strand in Shreveport, the long lines and all that kind of stuff. But he didn't have a distributor, and he was four-walling, if you're familiar with four-walling.
Yes.
So he was renting the theater and paying all the expenses, and he would get the box office at the end.
Right.
And he would have to wait. So he bound us all in the car. We would have to, there were 3 kids, and we would be in the back of that little Corvette. And then my mother, and we would drive to Shreveport, and we would wait until a certain point in the film when the box office would release the funds. Back then, you had to wait to like 3/4 of the way through the movie before they would give you the cash in case somebody wanted their money back.
Right.
So, yep. So I would be in the back of the theater, and I would fall asleep. Like, I would just kind of sleep on the back of the chair until they would release the money and say, come on, let's go. And then we'd go back we would go back, and he would like to tease that he was running out of gas at Boggy Creek. It's like, oh, look where we just passed. We just passed over Boggy Creek. Oh my gosh, you didn't tell me to get gas. I'm running out of gas. So he liked to do stuff like that. But he would he would get that money, and it was a lot of money. I don't know how much it was. Mr. Lidwell told me later on, Steve Lidwell, the son, told me that their initial run was Texarkana, Shreveport, El Dorado, and Monroe. And he said that he would go and pick, later than Steve goes, and he starts picking up the money.
Right.
And he told me it would be $40,000 when he would get back. At $2, that's when tickets were $2 a piece. So his trunk would be just filled with his cash. So, but still he did, he had called Hollywood trying to get a distributor. They hung up on him. And so he's, it's doing really well locally. And so he's renting these theaters. He doesn't realize it, but he's renting some of the theaters that were owned by Joy Houck. And Joy had these Joy cinemas, and Actually, he owned the Joy on Canal Street in New Orleans, which has the great big Joy sign. I think it's the biggest movie sign there on Canal Street. But anyway, so Joy gets, he takes notice because the Legend of Boggy Creek actually, for a long time, and I'm told it still may stand today, but it broke concession stand records.
Really, eh?
So, yeah, and theater owners that's how they make their money, is in the concession stands.
Yeah.
So Mr. Houck saw it. So he saw these grosses from the concession stand. That's what first got his attention. So he actually physically comes to our house and knocks on the door. And my dad, I told you, had bought the Corvettes and, anyway, and my mother's like, okay. So we lived in this house and my mother wanted him to buy this house. Mm-hmm. And so she was kind of bugging him, like, you need to go to the bank and get a loan to buy the house. Now, I know that you're making enough money, that you can pay for the house. So he had made an appointment. And that very day, Mr. Houck knocks on the front door. My dad goes and he opens the door. And Mr. Houck was this very elegant man. But anyway, he said, he introduced himself and he said that, what he was there for. And my dad said, he said, can you talk to me? Can you sit down and talk to me? And my dad said, you have no idea how much I want to talk to you, but I have a meeting at the bank that I have to go to. Mm-hmm. And he's like, my wife is, I've got this. So Mr. Houck said, so he kind of started quizzing him a little bit. And he said, so how much are you looking for or whatever? And the house wasn't a lot. It was like $32,000 or $33,000 or something. It wasn't a lot. Yeah. And so my dad told him, and Mr. Houck said, well, I tell you what, if you will stay here and have this meeting with me, I will write you a check right now for that amount, and you can have it and you can keep it, no matter if I do a deal with you or not.
Really?
And my dad was like, oh, okay. So that's how my dad got a distributor and my mom got her house.
That's incredible. And how quickly, because I know that there was a lot of pressure for a sequel, right? How quickly did the pressure start for that?
Immediately. I mean, success, that's what people want to do. They want to repeat it almost immediately. And my dad really wanted to do something different.
Right.
And so he does Bootleggers as his second film, mm-hmm. which is actually a really good film. Mr. Ledwell actually assigned that film to me as well. And I've just restored that one at the Eastman Kodak Museum. So anyway, but then in 1975, he was doing Winterhawk and he wanted to do Dreaded Sundown next.
Right.
But Mr. Ledwell, they were a very prominent business in Texarkana. And as you may or may not know, the town that Dreaded Sundown is also based on a true story.
Right.
And that killer had never been caught. And many of the victims' families still lived in Texarkana. They were still alive and all that kind of stuff. And so Mr. Ledwell said, no, he wasn't going to, that my dad could, that he wasn't going to okay that. So that's when they split. And so Mr. Ledwell got The Legend of Boggy Creek, which had been playing nonstop since 72 to 75. It was playing by that time, the drive-ins.
Yes.
Some places it played for like a year, I'm told.
Yeah.
Because it just continued to do business. So, and home video was not a thing at that time.
No,
in 75, it's being talked about. Like they had Sony, Beta, and that kind of stuff, but really hadn't even hit the market yet. So Mr. Ledwell took those, and Mr. Ledwell was in, like I said, he was in the trucking business. He was done with the whole thing. Like, I'm done. He'd made a whole bunch of money. And so he just shelved it basically. And then my dad finished Winter Hawk and he released it with Mr. Hawk. And Winter Hawk did really well as well. None of them did the box office ever, though, that Boggy Creek did.
No.
Winter Hawk won some awards. It won like a NATO, the National American Theater Owners Association. They voted it. My dad, I think, was a producer of the year or something. But going back to Boggy Creek a little bit, Boggy Creek was a G-rated film.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and that baffles, again, watching it last week, Pamela, that boggles my mind because, you know what, if I can, I'd like to tell you my story of how I first saw Boggy Creek. Because I'd like to give you a sense of what it means to me. I was 8. And you have to understand where I came from in the UK. The UK is definitely at that point was a very censored country when it come to horror movies. Anything that was even remotely creepy, late at night. So my mom and dad were kind of at that point where they're kind of, vetting, letting me watch, some of the older black and white horror movies, the Draculas and stuff. Friday night, 6 o'clock, they usually show a sci-fi movie on BBC Two. Usually something like Forbidden Planet, something the day the earth stood still. I'm sitting down to eat my supper and on comes The Legend of Boggy Creek. So I'm like, what's this, right? So I sit there and it's like it seemed to me like one of these kind of documentary Disney type things. And just as my mom would walk out the room, there would be the dead cat or, she'd come in and put my dinner and something nice would be going on. Then there's the monster with the arm through the window. And I'm watching it as a kid and I'm thinking, I can't believe that this is on at 6 o'clock. And I'm mowing down my food and I wouldn't take my eyes off the screen, right? And the climax really packs a punch when the creature is kind of unhinged and is going after that family. Yeah. Anyway, I go into school on Monday. I'm telling you, Pamela, all the kids were like, did you see that movie on Friday at 6 the Boggy Creek and the like, we couldn't believe it, right? So yeah, so like it's insane to me that to come back to what you said, that I find out later that this is a G-rated film. Wow.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Well, because there's no real violence other than that just little skirmish there, whatever, but there's no real violence. There's no swear words, so mostly it's one of these psychological thrillers, really, if you think about it. It gives you just enough of a jolt. So then you go back and you think about it. It's like, now, what did they say? And I do think it was really smart of my dad that he starts the film out with that card that says, this is a true story.
Yeah.
Based on true events. Some of the people and some of the locations are the extra, which now you see on Unsolved Mysteries and that kind of stuff. Some of the people are actually playing themselves. So he uses that, and then he uses the whole soundtrack of the swamp. So you're kind of listening to that. And let me tell you this, that is an actual vocalization of the creature that they captured there while they were recording.
Are you serious?
That's the first recorded vocalization of one of these creatures.
That is really cool. That is super cool.
So they were, he was out there later on, not too long ago, about a year and a half ago or so, I talked to Travis Crabtree. And so, yeah, and I said, Travis, how did my dad find you and your dad? His dad's smoking. So he said, well, because it was in all the newspapers, because Lynn, his older brother, had actually had an encounter. But Lynn did not want his name used. He did not want his story used.
Okay.
So it's not in the movie. Lynn's encounter with the creature is not documented in the film. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. So Smokey is hired as a guide. So he's taken, my dad and Earl around to different people that have, seen it, or with Herb Jones doesn't believe in it, whatever. So they're interviewing people. And Travis told me, he said, I remember Earl just writing as fast as he could as the people were telling him about the encounter, like what they were talking about. And Earl was writing everything down. And then, so I said, so you didn't see it? He said, no, but they all heard it the day that they were shooting with the dogs.
Wow.
So as that scene where all the Pride dog hunters come together, the creature was up in front of them, he said, and so they heard it then.
My goodness, that's absolutely fascinating. That's fascinating. So I want to kind of join some dots here for a second, because we've mentioned the town that dreaded sundown, but especially for my UK viewers, because this film was very hard to come by. Again, getting back to the censorship issue, the town that dreaded sundown, I didn't actually see it until the 90s, but my cousin and I were aware of it. And the title alone, we were just like, wow, the town that dreaded sundown. Talk about titles I wish I'd come up with, because it's incredible. Yeah. So your dad hits the ball out the park with Boggy Creek, and he does it again because the town that dreaded sundown is a bona fide classic. It's really creepy, and it's got full of atmosphere. How did, as you said, it was based on a true story, this killer that was never caught. How does your dad come to the point where this is the project I'm doing next? Walk me through that.
So my dad and Earl would get together and they would write. And then according to who was producing, they wrote a lot of these kind of mountain men westerns, and then but everybody liked the horror. So when he joins up, he ends up going with Sam Arkoff.
Okay.
From American International Pictures.
Yes.
So Sam releases AIP, they called it back then. They released Dreaded Sundown, and then Victor's. I think he had a 3-picture deal with them, and then I think The Norseman. So he would work with the producer, whoever the money, whatever the money people wanted to do. He loved to do his character actors, and he loved the costuming and all that stuff for his kind of mountain man. Later on when Kevin Costner did Dances with Wolves, I know my dad that was kind of the epic that my dad was always kind of searching for and wanted to do, but never really had the money. So it's funny that his horror films have kind of stood that test of time. As I said, he wrote the famous line, "Go ahead, make my day," which is the American Film Institute's 6th most famous line. I was going to tell you too, when I finally located the film that we did the restoration from, I found it at the BFI, the British Film Institute.
I noticed, I saw that. I had a little bit of a swell of pride when I read that. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yes. So, and I shipped to the UK. It's amazing. I have a list of all the countries that I've shipped to, and I think it's about 29 or 30 now different countries that I've shipped Boggy Creek to. So it's famous all over the world.
So let's talk about the rest. Let's talk about the restoration then. Let's get to the restoration.
Can I give one more little piece of trivia though?
You can absolutely give us as much trivia as you like.
So when my dad's doing the pre-production and post-production, with Jaime and they introduce him to Ralph McQuarrie, and Ralph McQuarrie does the movie poster.
Okay. Oh,
And
oh yes. Wonderful.
yeah. So are you familiar with Ralph McQuarrie?
Very familiar, because I'll tell you why. I'm a big fan of Battlestar Galactica and Star Wars, and
Yep.
he did a lot of the conceptual art on those things, right? So yeah, I'm very familiar.
He did. Yep. So he was directly responsible with Lucas in creating Darth Vader and the stormtroopers and C-3PO and R2-D2 and Chewbacca. So Chewbacca, if you notice, has that Bigfoot influence.
Yes.
It's so I always tease that the Fount Monster's Chewbacca's daddy.
That's, and you know what? That's kind of, it's funny. That's kind of cool, because when I'm watching it last week, I'm thinking he's got that kind of Chewbacca-esque nature about him. And just on this, while we're talking about Ralph McQuarrie, there's a little, he's one of his Battlestar Galactica covers there that
Yeah.
I love him. I love his art. So my question to you, Pamela, is what point do you, okay, where is it in your life that you're like, you know what? I want to get this restored and remastered. How does that journey start?
So I raised 5 kids, and I worked with my husband. My husband is an inventor of all things, and so he dealt in intellectual property a great deal. So I was around that. And then when my father passed away in 2010, his estate was, I mean, basically it was taken. Okay, so everything was gone. It all disappeared. And my brother contacted me at a certain point, and he said that he had found a will. And we knew what the will said anyway. So he sends it to me, and I file for probate. And so I'm telling these people that have my father's documents and all that kind of stuff, I'm saying, you need to turn it over. And they're just ignoring me. They're kind of refusing to, cooperate, whatever. So I don't know what is what, I have no idea. So what do you do? I mean, you don't have any papers. You don't really have any direction. So I decide I'm going to go back to Steve Ledwell, to the beginning, right? It's like, okay, so what, I knew he was still in Texarkana. I had friends that were friends of his. Mm-hmm. And so one day in 2014, late 2014, I just picked up the phone and called him. Now, I had started to, so I was reading online comments early on. As I said, my husband was an inventor, and he was very early in the internet. And so by the time I get on, it's Ask Jeeves is the search engine. And so I sat down for the very first time, and I said, who is Charles B. Pierce? And when I did, up popped a ton of things. It was overwhelming almost. Not websites, because there really weren't websites like we have now. Yeah. It was more like chat rooms. And the number one thing, over and over and over, they would say, someone needs to work out the copyright and get us a good print. So I started reading that. And over the years and then decades, I continued to read this. And so anyway, at one point in time, I do go to my dad. So after asking Jeeves, I called my father, because my father was struggling financially by that time. And artists kind of go up and down and like that. And so I called him and I said, hey, Dad, who has the rights to Boggy Creek? Because, and you didn't ask my dad personal questions like that. You could ask him about his love life and that kind of stuff, but you didn't really ask him about business. And so he was like, I said, well, let me just tell you why. I said, you've heard of the internet? And he was like, yeah, I've heard something about that. Like it was pretty early, Mm-hmm. So So he's like, yeah, I think I've heard. I said, well, it's like the library on steroids. And so I told him, I said, I asked him who's Charles B. Pierce. And I said, let me just read you some of these things that these people are writing. So I told him, and so he starts laughing. And he says, well, let me tell you. He said, I traded that to Buddy. Well, he hadn't actually traded it. It turned out that my dad didn't own those films.
Okay.
My dad didn't own any of his films. But I didn't know that at the time. You know, I mean, he was paid as if he, you know, was an owner. But on the first two, Boggy Creek and the Legend of Boggy Creek and Bootleggers, they had been held by Mr. Lidwell, who put up all the money.
Right. Okay.
And so, anyway, so by the time that I get to Mr. Lidwell, so I didn't really know for sure who held the rights. Though my dad does call me at a certain point in time, not too far later, and he's laughing and he says, guess what I'm looking at? You know, and it was at Walmart, you know, it was out there. So, but now that's going to be the pan and scan. Okay. So
yes,
he didn't, and I didn't care, you know. Now, the other thing too is because I had seen Boggy Creek so many times, like going to, you know, Shreveport to pick up the box office and falling asleep. I mean, I had seen it hundreds of times, probably. Yeah. So by the time that it would come on television and stuff, I wasn't paying much attention, you know. So I didn't see it for a whole lot of years. So I moved north, and so when I finally get a hold of Mr. Lidwell, I called him that night. It was like late afternoon, and I said, you know, I said, do you remember me? It was like, yes. Anyway, so I said, you know, my dad, you know, I said, he said, Pam, your daddy never came back here, like to get the rights, you know. And I said, he didn't. It was like, no, he didn't. We haven't gotten any money from Boggy Creek since 1975. And I was like, you know, I was like, so I said, well, would you let me do it? Would you? Because by that time, people were asking for the Blu Ray, you know. Right, so I said, would you, if I could find a good print and restore it, because that was the second thing, work out the rights and get us a good print. Right. So I said, would you allow me to? And he said, yes, run with it. And I had major surgery and was kind of bedridden at that time and I could barely walk. But during that time of my recovery, I got on the computer and I started digging. I was looking for copies. And anyway, it ended up taking 4 years to find a good print. But at a certain point in time, Technicolor, I'd been given a lead that the originals, the negatives, and the sound reels, all of that had been at Technicolor. And around that time that my dad was doing the pan and scan, Mr. Lidwell hired a lawyer and had all of the elements shipped back to Texarkana. Mm-hmm. And so I had that documentation that they were there, but it's a huge facility. You know, I mean, they deal with giant trucks and, you know, it kind of takes up a whole area of town, to be honest with you. And so Steve was telling me, Steve Lidwell was like, he said, I brought him the papers, you know. Yeah. I brought him the paperwork saying from Technicolor and the lawyers saying that it had been shipped there. So he said, so it's here somewhere. And so he said, well, I'll look for it, you know. Anyway, and it's still, though, it's 2017, December 2017, and Lyle Blackburn, the cryptozoologist that's written a few books on Boggy Creek, he contacted me and he said there's a 35 millimeter print up on eBay right now. Okay. And he said there's 2 bidders anonymously going after, you know, and he said usually prints go for $500 or $600. This one's up to about $2,000 now. Wow. He said, I know it's not public domain, but that rumor's out there. So I don't know if this is somebody trying to, you know, was like, okay. So I am bound
Somebody
and
trying to
determined
beat
that
you
I'm
to the
going.
punch.
Yeah. So I mean, because like I said, people have been asking for that
Yeah.
all those years. I was reading online, somebody needs to do this, somebody needs to do this.
Right.
So I mustered all my resources, and I actually put I think I said that I would go up to like $10,999 or something.
Yeah.
I was bound and determined that I was going to win that print.
Wow.
And I did. I won the print. And then it was just a couple of days before Christmas that I got it. And it had come from the Joy Cinema in New Orleans.
New Orleans, right?
So they were renovating it after the big Hurricane Katrina. They had restored that theater, and when they were restoring it, they had found this print. So I posted it on Facebook, and I'm friends with a lot of Boggy Creek fans.
Yep.
And so one of the fans wrote to me and said, do you have anyone to restore it? And I did not. So he said, I have some connections at the George Eastman Museum if you would like me to put you in touch. And so early on, when I had become the administrator of my father's estate,
yes,
the attorney had told me, he said, think like your father. Okay, you want to try to think like your dad. So I knew that the George Eastman Museum, was like of the highest caliber.
Yeah.
And because it had lived in pan and scan all of those years, and it really had that kind of B movie connotation, which it is a B movie, but I think it's more than that. But I wanted to give it some kind of respect a little bit. I wanted someone with a really sterling name to do it. So I was able to convince them. So the guys that have, they had seen it back in the 70s, in 73 to 75 during that time. So they were familiar with it. They, and they're very professional. They really kind of know what they're doing. So we had a great time. They're in Rochester, New York, and I live in New Hampshire. So I would drive there. It's like 7 or 8 hours, but I would go over there, and they have a school. So they teach this film restoration.
Yeah.
And we had students work on it. So that was fun, to have young people that were working on it that weren't even born at the time. And, they all liked it. So it's been a wonderful experience.
But that's a
that's
a testament to it,
Yeah, well, and it really is the story, it was filmed, it was in that kind of handheld or whatever, that kind of true grit kind of style, but it's a very compelling story, and so it kind of captures that essence too. Lots of people write to me and they say that it brings all of those feelings rushing back. Like when they see it, they tell me it's like watching The Wizard of Oz when it goes from black and white to color.
Yeah.
They also tell me it's like watching the movie for the first time. See, you haven't seen it yet. If you saw it on television, you haven't seen it in that wide.
No.
So it was actually critically acclaimed at the time that it came out, and mostly for its cinematography. And so now all of that's back. They would say, oh, it's so beautiful, So believe it or not, it is a beautiful film. So you're going to see that soon. Yours should be there any day now.
I want to actually say to the Ice Creams viewers that are watching this, Pamela has the version that I saw again was unfortunately one of the older, but Pamela's been wonderful enough to send me a 4K copy. We're going to be dropping the links in the description section of this video after the fact, so that fans that don't know where to get it can come to you and pick up a pristine copy. I can't wait personally to see it. And I'll be doing a separate video with my thought, and I'll send that to you so you can see my
Sure, yeah.
silly cheesy grin when I'm watching it. Like, you know, for
Now, let me say this too. After Eastman finished their film restoration, I decided, to me, the sound, and to my father, the sound, like I said, was, whether it was the sound of the swamp or the creature or the Hey Travis Crabtree, that was a very important part of the film. So I took it. By that time, Mr. Ledwell had found those originals. So in October of 2018, they finally found the original elements. They were upstairs in a conference room that was no longer used, but they were redoing that area in the conference room. So they found it in a closet.
oh,
So
wow.
Kyle at Eastman said on the print, he said, we're not going to do any better than what we've got from the BFI.
Yep.
So to start all over is just a waste of money. But we did use the original magnetic sound reels.
Okay.
And they went to Audio Mechanics, which is in Burbank. And Audio Mechanics does like kind of the who's who of movie sound restorations. So they did an entire remaster and restoration of the soundtrack.
Okay.
So not only does it look beautiful, but you can actually hear it now.
Amazing. Amazing. Could you see yourself
And
doing something similar for the Town That Dreaded Sundown, Pamela?
so the Town That Dreaded Sundown is owned by, so AIP went to Orion, and then that went to MGM, and now I think it's actually Sony. So hopefully one day, maybe I can go and work some kind of a licensing deal and gain those rights. I've spent a great deal amount of time digging to see who owns what, and where the copyrights lie. So I have the first two now, and so I'm trying to do justice to those. We have a vinyl soundtrack coming out, the vinyl records. It'll be a double album.
Okay.
And we have a CD coming out, and I believe that they're putting it on cassette as well, which will be super fun. And then of course digital. And then I want to do some more products with the Ralph McQuarrie image. That's an iconic kind of Bigfoot. So
absolutely.
Everything from, like the little collectibles and that kind of stuff. So I want to kind of concentrate on that. As I said, I just restored and remastered Bootleggers. So those are the two that I have right now. And I'm making sure that they're all preserved and taken care of in the right way. And then I may go for, I'm not sure which one I'm going to go for next. But anyway, there's a few more things that I can't talk about just yet. But the Boggy Creek will definitely live on for future generations.
And you know what? I can't imagine a world without it. This Pamela, thank you so much for joining us today. And do me a favor, before we say goodbye, please keep me at Ice Creams updated on it, because I'd really be interested, now that you've got over this wonderful hurdle there and got the Legend of Boggy Creek out there. I'd be really interested to hear, how your journey goes with the Town That Dreaded Sundown, because that's a whole other story right there. That's such a wonderful film. But is there, before we conclude, is there anything you'd like to say to your fans out there who watch Ice Creams, who are fans of your dad's work there?
Well, just check out the new, restored, remastered The Legend of Boggy Creek, and then be sure and leave a review, if you will. And I just thank everyone for supporting it and helping us get this far. And we won well, we came in first runner up with the Rondo Hatton. Did you see
Right,
that?
I saw that. Yes, yes.
Yeah. So we got first runner up for best Blu Ray DVD, and we came honorable mention for best restoration. So for just a newbie and going up against Criterion and Warner Brothers, we were just thrilled.
Well, from this fan, thank you for doing that, Pamela, and thank you so much for sending me a copy. I can't wait to watch it in glorious 4K. Okay. Have yourself a wonderful evening, my friend. Thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you, you too.